There we go. Um, so hello, everyone. My name is Greg Wilson. I'm the Chief of Staff for the State Department of Education. I think you all know Rachel and Michelle. It looks like Spencer Barzy, our Eastern Idaho director, is on the line, is on this Zoom, so that's great. Um, I just wanted to provide basically a high-level overview of sort of this legislative session, which technically is not over. The legislature is kind of sitting and waiting before adjourning sine die next week to see if the governor vetoes any legislation. But essentially, our legislative session is over. The 2024 legislative session is over. So I just wanted the opportunity to provide just a high-level overview of the session, kind of through the lens of what charter school administrators, leaders would probably want to hear. We are next week starting our regional post-ledge tour. So we'll be in Region 6 on Monday, Region 5 on Tuesday, and then Region 4 on Wednesday. And then heading up north with Region 1 the following Monday, and then going to Region 2, and then finishing up in Region 3 on April 19th, Friday, April 19th. So it's going to be pretty fast and furious. So yeah, if you haven't signed up, hopefully you will sign up. That'll be a little bit more exhaustive than this, but this will be a very good preview of what we're going to be doing there. So I think, again, I don't want to dwell on this a little bit, but I mean, the legislative session, I think a lot of people, and we're going to talk a lot about this, I think as we talk with more of our school leaders about the legislature, because I think a lot of people ask, why is policy structured the way it is? Why do things look the way they do? And I think the reality is it comes down to the composition of the legislature. I think that this year, maybe we didn't take the lesson of heart, but I mean, the House Education Committee and the Senate Education Committee are very differently composed. And so what's possible policy wise really reflects that. And so I get a lot of questions, and I'm going to use House Bill 521, the facilities bill, as an example. Why was that structured as a tax bill? Why did that have certain components? I've heard people call the bill the Christmas tree bill. Well, why was it structured the way it was? And honestly, it was structured that way because all legislation, particularly education policy legislation that has a lot of scrutiny, has to go through a specific path, and every stop along that path, to get the necessary votes to get across the finish line looks a little bit differently. And so that was a very unique situation, I think, in this legislative session. Just, you could maybe call it maybe a different alignment between both the House Education Committee and the Senate Education Committee. I will say, a big takeaway for us, and I know that this will be a question, is just that for public charter schools, there is going to be unfinished business in the 2025 legislative session. I'll talk a little bit about the trailer bill that passed, 766, that addressed that facilities oversight in House Bill 293 from the 2023 session. But it sounds like with the facilities bill being implemented, the lottery distribution that would have gone out to our public charter schools needs to now be addressed. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. I know there'll be some questions about that. So before I kind of get into legislation, and I don't need to get in depth on the recodification of the charter school chapter, but obviously that is currently in law. That was House Bill 422. And I think the real intent of that, and I think it really comes out of the fact that Alex Adams, who at the time was also the DFM administrator, saw a statute that had been in place for 26 years and didn't work for our public charter schools as it needed to, and maybe didn't learn the lessons and the policy lessons that we had learned over the last 26 years. Very ambitiously came out of the gate in the 2024 session with this recodification of the charter school statute. And it sounds like a lot of you, either through Bloom, who have provided a lot of support on all the different structural features here, because I know it's a little confusing when there's not a red line version. It's basically a version that cuts and replaces an entire one. But it sounds like you've gotten a lot of support on sort of the different components around, whether that's how the renewal process, is going to change to the benefit of our public charter schools, or this notion of pilot charter schools, or some of the slight changes in definition, or even the appeals process shifting from the Board of Education to the Office Administrative hearings. I think the big 2 points that I want to make from the State Department of Education standpoint is one, that the law specifically, states that the State Department of Education will collaborate with the authorizer to enroll public charter schools in need of support and development programs, and really provide that support. And it's including but not limited to the Idaho Building Capacity Program. So the SDE's budget did pass or was set last week or the week before last, and it did have a component around what this support is going to look like. And so what you're going to see from the State Department of Education is Michelle Clement Taylor, Josh Notaboom, and federal programs and others doing some direct outreach to you about what that support's going to look like. And at this point, it's on our radar. Because K-12 budget and the SDE budget's one of the last thing to set. We didn't know the parameters that we were going to have around the amount that we were going to have available, but that plan is going to be rolling out in the coming weeks. The other thing I want to talk about with this new Chapter 52, Title 33, was just the charter specific teaching certificate. And if you go and look at that section of code, and we don't necessarily have to read this, but I know there's been some confusion about whether that charter specific teaching certificate is transferable to traditional public schools. That is not in the statute. There are some changes, like, for example, around the charter specific administrator certificate, and reducing those experience requirements from 5 years to 4 years, and that section of code was put in place in 2019. But specifically, the charter specific teaching certificate is not transferable. And I think the reason why potentially there's been some confusion about that is just there were several iterations of this statute, several drafts that were shared starting in November and December, and then I think were distributed to a lot of folks for their feedback. And I think that that's where that confusion lies. And fortunately, the department and others got to see all those different iterations. So when we heard about this and then went back to the law, we knew exactly why that confusion was in place. But I just want to make that point abundantly clear, and we'll figure out ways to follow up just to make sure you and your other charter leaders are aware of that change. And again, we can talk about that in the Q&A section. So as I stated yesterday, there was a trailer bill to House Bill 521 that passed. And really the idea was to address, concerns, missing components, unfinished business related to facilities that were not included in House Bill 521. And I think for the purposes of this group, I think there's two real important change. One is that restoration of charter fund facilities, or charter facilities funds that were, because of the change in the formula in House Bill 293, were excluded. And so that restoration happened. And I know a lot of our charter administrators were waiting patiently because there were several different iterations of what that was going to look like. There was one standalone bill that looked like it was going to pass. And then because it was late in the session, it became, with all candor, it became a hostage, basically. It became something that was needed to get done, but became part of other bargains and compromises that needed to be made in this space. And so ultimately it got done. And I think that a lot of that is due to the capable advocacy that you get from the Idaho Charter School Network. But it was in that final trailer bill that passed yesterday, which was essentially the last day of the legislative session. So it includes that floor of $400, which was important, and then kind of lets the formula work ahead. And then another thing that I heard a lot of concerns about from our charter schools was this issue around the 4-day, and whether it applies to charter schools, whether it doesn't apply to charter schools. what this new change did, and I think that that really is an outstanding question, but what this change did was basically let out a lot of the stress around what the 4 day versus 5 day was going to look like. And the code section essentially now will say that the school district attests that it meets the minimum student instructional day or hour requirements of the state department or the state board of education, which requirements shall be adopted no later than August 1, 2024, and implemented no sooner than July 2025. And so I think the previous version, I know if you read this, it is pretty clear and explicit that it is a school district, and the bill sponsors of this have said pretty regularly that yeah, this applies to school districts that take this money. But I do think that there were questions outstanding that needed to be resolved about whether if a state board of education, which technically provides oversight over all of our public schools, would those new minimums, particularly a new minimum day requirement, how universally would they apply? And that would have been a question that we would have had to grapple with. And I think it was worrisome to a lot of our charter administrators. So with this new language change, I think a lot of the worry around the 4 day versus 5 day has been taken away. And so, yeah, and then this is the new 335207 that just creates that new floor of $400 per attending student. So that's the language that was in, the several iterations of the legislation that passed to resolve the issues with House Bill 293. So something else that I just want to talk about too around this session was the supplemental for the FY 2024 budget. And so that's something that you're going to see by the end of the year, is that all of our school districts and public charter schools did see some kind of hit from the shift from enrollment to attendance, and it varies school district, charter school to charter school, school district to school district. But what a number one priority for Superintendent Critchfield was this supplemental for the FY 24 budget to really address the gap from that shift. And so when we middle of last year, 2023, we had initially estimated the gap for the upcoming year to be around $120 million. Then that in our budget request in September of 2023 went down to about $90 million, which we estimated the gap was going to be between shifting from enrollment back to seat time. The number we've kind of settled on early this year with our December numbers was around $161 million. And so what the legislature basically did is I don't think they gave, they didn't appropriate the full amount associated with the gap, but they did provide $105 million for the current year via discretionary. So that'll be distributed per support unit. And then for a total of $40 million, provided $20 million of that toward Career Ready Students CTE grant program, which that is, that was Superintendent Critchfield's number one priority in the 2023 session. So we received another $20 million there. We did not advocate for it. That was a decision by appropriators to do that. I think our budget request was for that all money to go toward our schools to address that gap, but that was a decision by the legislature. And then an additional $20 million went toward funding House Bill 292 distributions. And so if there is additional money associated with the gap above the $143 million, that will go out to schools distributed on a support unit basis via discretionary. And so I think that that's a very positive thing. So if the department's estimate at the end of the fiscal year is correct, and it's $161 million, then that balance of $16 million would go out to our school districts and public charter schools. So I just want to very quickly talk about some legislation that did pass at a very high level. And again, these are slides that I'll share with everybody or have Rachel share with everybody. But I mean, this is legislation that did pass that I do think, you just want to be aware of, that have kind of changed the programming and what you're going to have to do in each of your schools. So the first one is that there was an advanced opportunities bill that passed this year, that it did increase that minimum or that capped amount for our public school students from $4,125 to $4,625, and that has not been increased since advanced opportunities came into place in 2015, and so that's a really positive change, because we do know that there are more and more students that are meeting that cap, and that $4,125 per student really does reflect what the cost of getting maybe an associate's was 5, 6, 7 years ago. And then for the non-public school student program, which was implemented in 2021, that cap is raised from $750 per non-public school student to $2,500 per non-public school student. And again, the fiscal impact associated with this is very minimal. I just want to make sure that our charter leaders are aware that that amount has increased. Something else that was important that I know that a lot of our school district leaders and public charter school leaders were concerned about was just the shift in IDLA funding. And so what we in our budget request, it was important that some of the things that are within the K-12 budget shifted outside of the K-12 budget, particularly if they're not monies that are going directly to schools, but they're supporting other programming. So the superintendent's kind of two priorities for things to take out of the K-12 budget, so those increases didn't count against the increases to public schools, were Idaho Digital Learning Academy and Advanced Opportunities. And so we had to run a piece of legislation to actually take IDLA out of that public school budget. And what we did was we then modernized the funding for IDLA students and made it a per student funding structure, and then really had them as a standalone entity outside of the K-12 budget. So if their budget goes up $3 million, it's not, the perception across the street with the legislature isn't we've put $3 million toward our schools. And even though IDLA does very good things, I think that was a continuous frustration with the superintendent. It's the same with like the Advanced Opportunities program, is that when we'd see an increase of $2, $3, $4 million associated with that, that increase would be part of the bottom right-hand quarter of increases to school districts and public charter schools. So again, these are very small pieces of legislation, but I do think that there were ones we want you aware of, and there will be additional follow-on guidance that will come from the State Department of Education. But one that had run was related to limited English proficiency students, and they're taking the IRI, and so that was updated in statute to provide them the opportunity or the option for exempting those students. And that comes from Representative Sonia Galaviz, who herself is a teacher in the Boise School District and works with English language learners. And so this was a passion project for her. She worked very closely with my counterpart at the department, Ryan Cantrell, to basically put this forward. And, again, it's a very small change, but it's definitely an impactful change. So the next couple of bills that are pieces of legislation that I'm going to kind of talk about have to just do with content standards, curriculum, those kinds of things. And what I want to just convey to you is that there continues to be an interest in legislating kind of in this space. And so what we've tried to do as a department is, rather than maybe having a legislator step in and say, okay, we know that the State Board of Education maybe sets content standards, or local education agencies determine curriculum, trying to kind of figure out an off-ramp where they can kind of make the statement that they want about what our students should be learning about, and then also respecting other policymakers, particularly at the local level, who make a lot of these decisions, particularly around curriculum. So one was just a Senate concurrent resolution around civics education. And again, this was a group of legislators who I think really wanted the department they wanted legislation that would like embed Western civilization into our social studies content standards. And so what we had said was, well, we can do something where we recognize its importance, and then you can let the board and the department and folks that would participate in that standards review process to figure out a way to incorporate that and respect that process. So that was one example. Another one was around Holocaust education. Again, in light of what happened in Israel in October of last year, there were a lot of legislators who, just again feel like maybe our world history isn't properly addressing certain topics in light of current world events. And so one was, again, another concurrent resolution around Holocaust education. And again, when we get resolutions like this, what we do is we work closely with the board, just again to make sure that this stuff is incorporated in the standards, while respecting sort of the current balance between what we do here at the state level with standards and what you do at the local level with curriculum. Something that did get through legislatively had to do, again, with adoption education. There was a big push this year to update all the statutes around adoption in the state. And as I think folks can kind of figure out on their own, just with what has happened the last couple of years around some of these issues of life, this was a big important piece for legislators. And in one piece is just ensuring that if an LEA is, pursuing some kind of course of sex education instruction, that adoption is a feature of that. And that is currently in statute. So driver's education, and again, I'm going to kind of just hit these at a very high level. That was a piece of legislation that Governor Little had vetoed last March in 2023 from Representative Ron Mendive. And this is an example of, the department was, worked with Representative Mendive, with the governor's office, with others to figure out, okay, for, our rural school districts, which I think was one of the more immediate concerns for Representative Mendive, and for our districts in public charter schools that maybe don't have an online or have a driver's ed program, what could we do to support those students to have sort of the same opportunities as students in our more urban communities? And so this is currently law. And yeah, it provides a framework for parents to provide that on-road driving instruction. We made that a little more rigorous from last year, but then also for the online class component puts IDLA as kind of that designated provider for that. And again, who is the students in a rural school district is defined by Idaho Code 33319, or in an LEA that does not offer driver education are eligible for this. Another piece of legislation, again, I don't think it got a lot of coverage, but again, it's just a very simple piece of legislation, comes from Representative Matt Bundy, who he himself is an educator and a guardsman he works in the Mountain Home School District, and then he's in the Idaho Air National Guard. I think he knows a lot of his peers around the state who, I think some school districts and public charter schools do a very good job of recognizing sort of that additional service and the burdens associated with that. And other school districts and public charter schools, understandably, being in the Guard is a hardship. And I myself were in the Guard, and there's a reason I'm no longer in the Guard, just to the expectations, around juggling two careers. So what Representative Bundy wanted to do is basically just kind of create a floor for those LEAs that, maybe don't provide some kind of paid leave for educators who are also members of the Guard. And so this is what he did statutorily. Again, we really dug into it, feel like it's going to have a minimum fiscal impact. It really just addresses maybe a few dozen educators in the state, but this was a big priority for him. And this is just something that as school leaders, you should be aware of. So before I close out and take any questions, I just want to briefly talk about just a few kind of future issues just for you to be aware of. Because believe it or not, I mean, we are already kind of gearing up for the 2025 legislative session. The department's going to be expected to set a budget for K-12 by September 1, believe it or not. And then I guess we're going to spend 3 or 4 months advocating for that. So I think the first one that I know a lot of you have heard about that we were not able to get done this year for a lot of different reasons, but that we're going to come back to is basically shifting the way we do discretionary funding to a weighted per student amount. And the reason why this continues to be a priority is that even though we have a supplemental in place for FY24 for that shift from enrollment to attendance, there still is going to be a gap in FY25, and we'll know more in the coming months about what that's going to look like. And so the intent of the superintendent is to make sure that all of that funding, there's a mechanism in the school funding formula that captures that. And we feel like shifting discretionary from a per support unit basis, which is again kind of structured or founded on attendance, to a per student amount can really make sure that all of our LEAs can capture that money. And so what we had put forward this year was about $382 million, which is in the current budget. So the amount for discretionary is what we, wanted for this. The shift hasn't completely happened. But what we want to do next year is we want to shift to this weighted per student amount. And I think for public charter schools, what's important is through working through this bill with Representative Horman, Senator Den Hartog, Representative Clow, he was a big supporter, Representative Yamamoto. We just became acutely aware of the impacts to our very small schools, whether that was rural and remote traditional public schools or our public charter schools. And so we're going to come back with this. I think what's going to be important, and kind of you'll see our kind of final iteration of where we landed, was really having sort of a base amount of around $900 per student, but then having stackable weights. And I think a lot of you are already familiar with the weights that we've been advocating for since last September, which was around special education, English language learners, and economically disadvantaged. 2 more weights that we are going to add that we've been engaging with our partners like the Idaho Charter School Network are around just a weight around small schools. So, schools with less than 800 of average daily attendance. And so that would impact a lot of your schools. And then our at-risk students, particularly ones that are enrolled in an alternative program. And so that would address our LEAs like Elevate, which, kind of in early iterations of this had to be held harmless. Our number one objective in this is to ensure that every school district and charter school is not a loser, that they're actually gaining. And I think another reason why this is a priority for the superintendent is it creates a mechanism for us in like a way like special education to start directing more money towards special education. We're very restricted by what we can do with updating the divisors in the school funding formula. And so the superintendent continues to be committed toward putting another 60, 70, $80 million toward special education to kind of address that other gap that's out there that's been reported on the last year or so. And we feel like that this is the way to do it. So I just want to make you aware that we're coming back with this. Something else we're going to be coming back with is just outcomes-based funding. And again, kind of going back to my first slide, this was a good example of something that did, we got out of the House committee very easily. We got off the House floor relatively easy, had a lot of support for it. And then we got to the Senate Education Committee and kind of ran into that buzzsaw, which was frustrating because we feel like that this speaks directly to a lot of those members and what they've said that they want, where they want education dollars to go to, namely not paying for inputs, but paying for outputs, paying for performance. And so our intent is to bring this back next year, particularly because we look at it as a mechanism, again, to put more money toward secondary outcomes and put more money toward math. We are very supportive and very appreciative. And I was when I worked in the governor's office, worked very hard for early literacy dollars, but the superintendent and the state board have recognized that our grades 5 through 8 math specifically are an area where we could use a lot more state investment. And so basing that as an example on growth and on proficiency would ensure that all of our school districts and public charter schools would get a distribution that they could put toward curriculum or any other kinds of interventions or programming they would want to do around math. And then the last thing before I get to questions is I just want to talk about something that you may have heard about, but this summer we're going to spend a lot of time doing a pretty comprehensive review of our graduation requirements. The reality is our graduation requirements haven't been reviewed 12, 13, 14 years in a very comprehensive way. And they really do reflect the landscape before we had advanced opportunities, which came into play in 2015, career ready students, which we passed last year, or launch. And so I just want to reassure everybody, there's going to be surveys that get sent out. We're going to have a landing page website where all interested parties can go and look and see, okay, what's being contemplated for graduation requirements. The superintendent isn't envisioning in her conversations with board members, creating all these additional requirements, but basically recalibrating the existing requirements and providing the support and structure for LEAs to make sure that their students that are, graduating, have what they need, whether they're going to college. I mean, obviously, you want to array your credits a certain way if you're planning on going to college versus if you're going on a more of a career technical education track or in the military. And what we've seen in a lot of states is that they're able to structure graduation requirements to really sort of help a student, not pigeonhole them, because I know we don't want to pigeonhole our students, but help kind of structure them to be as best prepared possible for whatever comes after they graduate. Again, whether that's in the military, there's a lot of states that, again, ensure that a student is maybe taking the ASVAB when they're in that 11th or 12th grade year, or they're taking maybe certain courses over others. And it's the same with a college ready or a student that wants to be college ready, making sure they're taking the right amount of math and English, and they're arraying their advanced opportunities credit in a certain way so that they can limit how many of those prerequisites they need to take. So that's going to be something that we're going to be working on through the summer. And with that, I'm willing to take any questions that you might have. And I recognize that was a very fast and furious there.
Greg, we do have one question in the chat for Kelly Trudeau. She says, with the lack of lottery funding, will we be required to have the funds set aside for building maintenance?
We will get back to you about that. That is a good question. So when we're on our post-legislative tour, we're going to start handing out sort of 521 timelines and implementation process, the implementation process, but we're still working around what that's going to look like. But I will respond to that question directly, or we'll send out an answer to everybody. Something else that I just wanted to mention really quick was, and I'll let Spencer kind of answer, is on that minimum of $400, that money in that trailer, House Bill 766. I talked to Julie Oberly and Gideon Tolman yesterday, and I got a couple calls from some interested charter school administrators on when that facilities distribution would go out, and it will go out on time because that law, or that will be signed by the governor, I expect in the next day or two, and will be law. That trailer bill, it's our intent to distribute those facilities funds to our public charter schools later this month, early next month, which is in line with the way that distribution goes out every year. So, I think by and large, that's a positive that we, that even though that mistake occurred in the 2023 session, we're still on track to make that distribution. And that was something that we reassured everybody, whether it was the charter school network or other charter school leaders, that we would be able to do. And here we are, despite some of the back and forth that, associated with that. I don't know, Spencer, did I cut you off?
Nope, that was perfect.
Okay.
Looks like Joel has a question.
I do. You talked about the supplemental request payment and that it's going to be paid out according to
Support units. Yes.
But I either I wasn't paying attention or you didn't say. It could have been either one. How much per support unit should we be looking forward to on that? You said 104 million, but that doesn't mean anything to me.
Yeah. I don't know, Spencer, do you have the number off the top of your head? What was the amount specifically that was in the appropriation bill?
Well, Joel, if you take that 104 million and you go into your program foundation calculation in your secure login, there's a decimal number on the bottom right hand part of that document. I can help you with it afterwards. But it's going to be like, I mean, your size is going to be like 0.0028, and you take that times 105 million, and that's going to be a pretty close estimate to what your allocation is going to be. Like, I would feel comfortable with you going off of that number, and I can help. I can call you after and go through it with you.
Sure.
Is
Almost
that
like
only
he's
going
gotten
to apply
that.
for?
Oh, go ahead.
Is that sorry? Is that only going to apply for schools that had a gap, or is that just it's going to be across the board for everybody?
Like that, I believe the intention has to be across the board for everybody. Like it's just the same allocation based upon your support units, and that's which is driven.
Okay, and then I think like that decimal you're talking about, they call it the ratio in that document.
Yes.
Right.
Yep. It's
Okay.
in the fine print, the bottom right hand side. It's your ratio. Thanks, Alicia.
Perfect. Thank you.
What other questions do we have? Oh, we have one in the chat.
IDLA.
Yeah. Does H452 change any current payment processes or requirements for using IDLA?
No. Right, Spencer? Okay. Spencer has the benefit of being on the road the last couple of weeks and fielding a lot of these questions. And again, that IDLA, I know there was a lot of heartburn around it, but really the intent was it's just frustrating for those increases. And I know they support students and they're very important, but they're just not, it should not be in the K-12 budget proper. There are a lot of, support budgets that we have in the K-12 space where that seemed more appropriate. And so that's where we were really making the change. And, again, by the time everything was over, I felt like whether it was Jeff Simmons, whether it was, state board members who are advocates for IDLA and members of the legislature that are advocates for IDLA, everyone felt like we landed in a really good place of updating the formula, but then also making some really good changes to put that in its proper place in the budget. Here we go. Oh.
What other questions do we have?
I don't know, Spencer, was there anything I missed? Anything that you maybe could have gotten more clarification? I don't want to leave anyone hanging on anything.
Oh, I thought it was all covered perfectly.
Oh, well, if there are no questions at the moment, we're going to go ahead and end the session, but feel free to email questions to me and I can direct them to proper person. I appreciate you guys logging in today.
And again, we'll get back. We'll get back to everyone around the issue around the lottery funds. That was something that was flagged to me fairly recently, and I did talk with Julie Oberly about it yesterday. I think the total amount of that distribution for our public charter schools is, I think it's $2.7 million. So yeah, like I said at the outset, I mean, there's just some unfinished business there. And there's some outstanding questions about the implications. So we'll get that out as soon as possible.
Thank you so much, Greg. Any more questions before I end the session?
I do have a
Thanks.
quick question on that
Oh,
specifically.
yes.
Have we got that money this year? I'm sorry, I haven't looked in my payments for the lottery, or is this affecting us next year, what we're gonna get affected on?
Well,
I
House
think it-
Bill, House Bill 521 is effective July 1st, isn't it, Greg?
Yeah, so it would be FY 25.
Okay,
You're-
so
I
this
don't
year's
know.
payments are the same. It's next year that we're gonna be concerned about with our lottery payment.
Yes.
Great
And
question.
I apologize. I was trying to think if I like through all my emails, because I get those distribution emails, those public school finance, if I've seen a lottery one, and I don't know if I have.
What other questions do we have?
The lottery payments usually paid out in October,
We would have.
so we've already received that one, so it's,
Okay, so it would be October, but I mean, again, you're not going to receive it. I mean, I think the hardship, honestly, is you're not going to receive it in October until it gets fixed by the legislature early next year. Okay.
All right, well, I'm gonna go ahead and end our call today. I appreciate you guys for participating. And thank you for your questions. Greg, thank you. Thank you, Spencer.
Thanks, Spencer. See ya.
Thanks, everybody, for participating.